Good morning, my name is Desiree Timms. I serve as President and CEO of Innovation Ohio, which is a member of the Equal Districts Coalition. We're proud to be the largest redistricting coalition in the state, with 33 advocacy organizations and labor unions fighting for fair maps. All 33 Equal District partner organizations are based in Ohio, and we cover a broad range of issues. Some of us are unions fighting for worker rights. Some are working towards specific policy goals, such as reproductive freedoms and environmental justice. Some of us lift up community voices, such as AAPI Ohioans, Muslim Ohioans, Black Ohioans, LGBTQI Ohioans, moms, students, working Ohioans, and many more. But all of us are harmed by rigged district lines and the extremist politicians they elect by default. Our demands are simple, and they shouldn't be partisan. We want constitutional maps that reflect how Ohioans actually vote. Extremism will cost innocent Ohioans their lives, turning Ohio into the Wild Wild West and not the wonderful Buckeye state which working families enjoy and love. We have two goals today. First, we will explain why the most recent Republican-drawn maps are unconstitutional and unacceptable, and what might happen next in this chaotic process. Second, we will discuss the impact of this Republican constitutional crisis from several unique perspectives. Then we will open the floor for Q&A. A reminder to the press, we will send a press kit at the conclusion of the press conference with the order of the speakers for your reference. And with that, we'll get started. I'll now turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Richard Gunther, Professor Emeritus at the Ohio State University.
Thank you very much. I'm Richard Gunther, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Ohio State University. I've been working on redistricting reform in Ohio for 16 years, and I was one of the 5 persons who drafted the anti-gerrymandering provisions of Article 11 of the Constitution that were passed by the voters by more than 70% in 2015. Following our successes at the ballot box in 2015 and 2018, I was hopeful that these 2 referenda would finally put an end to gerrymandering in the state and had created a level playing field for the conduct of state and federal elections. Instead, I've been appalled by the intensely partisan spectacle in which the majority on the Ohio Redistricting Commission, or ORC, has repeatedly thumbed its nose at the Constitution and made a mockery of what was ratified by over 70% of Ohio's voters. These violations have been declared unconstitutional by the Ohio Supreme Court on 3 separate occasions, with 2 additional cases pending. Constitutional variations of violations involve both the processes through which district lines are to be drawn and the criteria that should guide this process. First, the amended Constitution calls for a transparent process for meaningful citizen input. Article 11, Section 1C3 requires that, quote, before adopting but after introducing a proposed plan, the Commission shall conduct a minimum of 3 public hearings across the state to present the proposed plan and shall seek public input regarding the proposed plan. Instead, none of the 5 proposals set forth by the ORC has allowed for citizen input of any kind regarding this proposal, or sufficient time to even read the proposed language, let alone evaluate it and consider alternatives. Votes were taken on proposals after only a few hours at most following their introduction. The Republican majority in the ORC has attempted to explain why this process was so rushed by blaming the late arrival of census data. But unreasonable delays by the Republican majority have characterized this process throughout, as one constitutional deadline after another was ignored, and one proposal after another was rammed through to approval without adequate time for deliberation and no time to consider revisions. To claim that a lack of time was responsible for this hurried and one-sided process is like murdering your parents and then asking the judge for leniency because you're an orphan. And with regard to the one legitimate concern, temporal concern, the May 3rd primary, there is, in my opinion, a simple solution. Postpone the primary. We used to have primary elections in June and they worked perfectly well. The basic thrust of the 2015 and 2018 constitutional revisions was to replace a closed partisan process with a more transparent bipartisan endeavor. Instead, map drawing was undertaken exclusively by the legislative staff of the majority party in complete secrecy, and even some Republican members of the ORC expressed irritation that they were completely shut out of the process. As stated in the January 12th ruling by the Supreme Court, Senate President Huffman and House Speaker Cupp controlled the process of drawing the maps that the Commission ultimately adopted. No other Commission members had access to the Republican legislative staff members who drew the maps, nor did other Commission members have any role in drawing the plan. And this exclusion and secrecy became even more pronounced as the redistricting process evolved. The third version of the legislative map was passed on February 24th after the Democratic majority on the ORC were given less than 3 hours to read this complicated proposal, and after less than 20 minutes of discussion by the Commission. With regard to violations of the map drawing criteria set forth in the Constitution, we need to distinguish between the General Assembly and the congressional districts because these criteria are different. Article 11 of the Constitution, as amended by 2015, includes 3 anti-gerrymandering criteria for General Assembly districts in Section 6. One states the district should be compact. Another requires that the partisan balance of districts statewide should, quote, correspond closely to the preferences of the voters. And a third prohibits the creation of maps that favor a particular party. The Ohio Supreme Court has declared unconstitutional the first 2 maps passed by the ORC for violating these criteria. In the first map, the Republicans on the ORC attempted to claim that Section 6 criteria were merely, quote, aspirational, end quote, even though that language can be found nowhere in Article 11. And therefore, they argued that these criteria should not be followed, or need not be followed. The Supreme Court, however, made it clear that maps that do not respect these criteria are unconstitutional. In their February 24th map, the Republican map drawers employed a new tactic in their attempt to neutralize Section 6. They counted as, quote, Democratic leaning, quote, a large number of districts that most observers would regard as toss-ups. For the Ohio House, for example, 19 districts were created within a range of 50 to 52% favorable to Democrats. Thus, a decline in the Democratic vote of just 2% in these districts would produce a veto-proof Republican majority of 73 seats, while Democrats would occupy just 26 seats. It's important to note that none of the Republican seats in the so-called 54-18 map was favored by fewer than 52.6%. Hence, a 2% decline in votes for Democrats would shift 19 seats to the Republicans, while a 2% decline in the Republican vote would shift no seats to the Democrats. In short, this map would virtually guarantee a permanent Republican majority, if not supermajority. Turning our attention to congressional redistricting, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that the November 1st plan is, quote, invalid in its entirety because it unduly favors the Republican Party and unduly splits a number of counties. It ordered the General Assembly to adopt a new congressional district plan that complies in full with Article 11 of the Constitution. However, the General Assembly did not deliberate over these revised plans. Instead, House Speaker and Senate President reconvened the ORC, claiming that by doing so, the two, quote, unduly clauses of the Constitution do not apply. The ORC then proceeded to draw a map that would create 10 safe Republican districts and just 3 Democratic districts, with 2 toss-ups. This is a far cry from the 8 to 7 partisan shares that would result from the drawing of a fair map. In order to do so, it resorted to the classic gerrymandering tricks of packing an overwhelming number of Democrats into 2 districts and cracking Democratic-leaning portions of Franklin, Cuyahoga, Hamilton, and Summit counties. If, as anticipated, the Ohio Supreme Court strikes down the 2 most recent maps, it will have become clear that the Republican majority controlling the ORC is unwilling to proceed in good faith to implement the anti-gerrymandering reforms favored by over 70% of the voters. 5 strikes and you're out. At that point, my own personal view is that the Ohio Supreme Court should take over the redistricting process. For the General Assembly, it should enact the so-called Rodden 3 legislative map, whose constitutionality has not been challenged, or another map that's in compliance with the Constitution, such as that submitted by the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission. Or it could appoint a special master to assist the ORC in revising its latest General Assembly map. And with regard to congressional districts, it should exercise its authority to create a new map of its own in compliance with the Ohio Constitution. The citizens of Ohio overwhelmingly oppose gerrymandering and favor fair maps, as they made clear in the 2015 and 2018 referenda. The secretive, partisan behavior of the Ohio Redistricting Commission and the permanent single-party dominance of our legislature and congressional delegation that would result from these maps are not what the voters of Ohio had in mind when they overwhelmingly passed these reforms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gunther, for those remarks. Now we will turn it over to State Rep. Smith.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'd just like to share a personal perspective on how the redistricting process is affecting so many people who, like me, are candidates, want to become candidates, want to participate in the democratic process and serve their communities and serve their neighbors. Some of us want the opportunity to continue to do that. Some people are new to the process, and I believe at this point that the way that this process is being conducted by the members of the Redistricting Commission in the majority party who have control over the commission is intentionally making it hard for as many people as possible to participate in the process. I'm a mother of 2 school-age children. My children are in public school. I'm a homeowner. I have a lot of skin in the game and a lot of reasons to want to stay in a position where I can work to make Ohio a better place to live. But I also have a lot of roots and a lot of things at stake when I consider where I will run, how I will run, when I will run. People often ask why there aren't more women in elected office. I often ask myself why there aren't more mothers of young children in elected office. When we see processes work in this way, we can answer those questions quite easily. We know that oftentimes women are the caregivers in their family, whether they're caregiving for older members of the family or younger members of the family. In order for us to make professional decisions, we have to consider a whole village. I am very, very fortunate and unique in the fact that I am in a position where I can make a decision to actually move my family and disrupt our lives in order to move to a new district. But there are plans that need to be made. There are conversations that need to be had with young children who will be asked to make a big sacrifice and make a big change. And it sure would be nice if I would have the opportunity to begin making those plans and having those conversations. I want to say that the district that I represent was the only district in 2020 that was flipped from red to blue in the state of Ohio, the only statehouse seat. I don't think it's a coincidence that I am in a position where I've just been drawn out of that district. I was told as soon as I won the seat that I would be target number 1 for the Republicans. They would want this seat back. They would do anything to get this seat back. And we see in the current version of the map that they have divided my district, that I worked so very hard with a grassroots coalition of neighbors, family members, co-workers, PTA parents who I've served with, coaches of my kids' rec teams. It took all of us doing a heavy lift, spending our own money, raising money. It took blood, sweat, and tears to flip this district. It wasn't something that happened by accident or by magic. It was not something that happened in a top-down campaign where money was sent to us, where we were chosen or anointed. We worked together, shoulder to shoulder, as a community to earn the representation that we wanted. I'm very fortunate that that person was me. I want to continue to serve my neighbors and those people who worked so hard to elect me. They fought for me, and I'm going to fight for them. I'm going to stick with them. Most of my district has now been cut out of the district that I live in. I'm going to go where my constituents are. I'm going to go where they go. I'm not giving up on that. And if that means that I have to sell my house, move my children to new schools, we're going to do that as a family, because we don't have much choice in Ohio. If we're going to continue to live here, and I'm going to continue to raise my children in this state, it better get a lot less extreme than it is. It can't continue to be on a path where guns are everywhere, guns are in schools, my daughter won't have any autonomy over her body. It better get better quick, and I have to be a part of that. I cannot continue to have them here. I cannot continue to raise them in a state that is going in the direction that it's going. We will do what we have to as a family to continue fighting to make Ohio recognizable to us. This used to be a common sense state that was a safe place to live. It was a safe landing place for me and my single mom and my sister when we were trying to escape very difficult circumstances as children. We lived out of state for a while, but we came back to Ohio because it was our safe landing place. It no longer feels like a safe landing place to me, and I'm going to fight as hard as I can to keep being part of the process here at the Statehouse. So just wanted to share with you some of the perspective as a working mother. I think that the way that this process is being conducted only benefits really and is only going to work for people who don't have all the considerations that a working mother has, people who are sort of the elderly, right-wing, powerful guys on the Redistricting Commission who don't have to worry about how moving themselves around and moving the chips around the game board will affect all the people who count on them. And I think that's a real shame. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, State Representative Smith, for such passionate remarks. We see truly the impact of cheating. Next up, we will have Zach Roberts from the Ohio Veterans Network.
Good morning. My name is Zach Roberts, and I'm here today on behalf of the Ohio Veterans Network. OVN is a statewide organization of veterans, military family members, and supporters committed to improving the lives of everyday Ohioans. I myself am a post-9/11 veteran and current service member who has had to navigate the challenges of living while employed. It is because of that experience I'm here today. I find it absurd that we have policymakers trying to gaslight the public into believing that members of our legislature do not support military voters. This cannot be further from the truth. Leaders in the legislature and on the Redistricting Commission should be ashamed of their comments. The repeated failure to pass constitutional maps for Ohio's General Assembly and congressional districts has put them in a position where they must move our primary election date or run afoul of federal laws governing military and overseas voting. If the current politicians in charge had it their way, Ohio's military voters would be left with 2 fewer weeks to receive and cast their ballots. This is assuming, of course, that the content of their ballots won't change between the date their Board of Elections sends them their ballot and the date they return their ballot. Instead of trying to be funny with CABA and move requirements, Ohio's elected leaders should do the right thing, the constitutional thing, and lead by passing constitutional maps and moving Ohio's primary election date back so that all Ohioans will have equal access to voting in this important upcoming election. The current status of our country's civil-military relations is fragile, and Ohio's politicians should be mindful of using us as pawns in their gamesmanship. In the past 2 years alone, my brothers and sisters in arms have had to deal with a global health crisis, with witnessed and responded to a failed attack at the U.S. Capitol. And we've watched the Taliban retake Afghanistan after spending 20 years of losing brothers, sisters, family members in that fight. And this was all before Russia decided to invade Ukraine. And as they continue to attempt to destroy a democratically elected government. So now, as service members and families turn on the news every morning to see if they may be called upon to help preserve life and defend democracy abroad, the very least our legislators can do is make sure that our democracy is secure at home. So again, I'm calling on the leaders of the Ohio General Assembly and those on the Ohio Redistricting Commission to do the right thing and pass a law on constitutional maps and move Ohio's primary election date so that all Ohioans can safely and securely vote.
Thank you, Zach, for your remarks and for your service to our nation. Next up, I will have Robert Davis from AFSCME Council 8, and then we'll bring up Mark after that.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I know a lot has been said already about the entire process, so I won't be redundant in going over all of that. Again, my name is Robert Davis. I work for AFSCME Ohio Council 8. I serve as the political and legislative director. We represent approximately 35,000 workers here in Ohio, ranging from local government to non-teaching K-12 through non-teaching university employees and workers at public hospitals. This entire process of redistricting should work like we do in organized labor when it comes to contract negotiations. When we sit down with an employer to negotiate a contract, the employer pretty much holds all the cards in regards to being able to pay wages and benefits. However, the process is there to be fair. The same goes for the redistricting process here in Ohio. The process is down on paper to be fair. However, the Republican-led redistricting committee and the legislature have failed to live up to that fair process. You see them working behind closed doors to create a map, and then at the last minute, put the map out there for the other side of the aisle as well as the general public to look at. So that process is totally unfair. Now, our members supported the referendum to change the process when it was on the ballot some years back. We strongly supported that. We went out and worked for it and got it passed. And to see it come to this is just a shame. Our members are no different than the average working man and woman here in Ohio. Those individuals wanted to see the process change. They said it was too one-sided. And to see the Republican-led legislature redistricting committee put their thumb on the scale to tip things in their favor, it's just not a fair process at all. So we want to see this process play out. We want to see fair maps and give everybody an equal shot. I know some districts are more blue, some districts are more red. But however, those districts that are considered quote-unquote swing districts, we want to see that process be fair and play out. Our members support certain candidates. We support candidates on both sides of the aisle. And a lot of organizations and individuals look to organize labor as far as to look and see who they support as well, to kind of get a gauge on who supports working men and women here in this state. So we want the process again to be fair, and so every candidate has an equal shot at being elected. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for your remarks and for all that you do for working Ohioans across the state. Now I'm going to bring up Professor Mark Brown from Capital Law to talk a little bit about what's going on with the cheating Republicans.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you. How are you working? I have nothing to do with this work. I have nothing to do with pretty much anything involved in this case. I'm kind of an outside observer. My interest is in the rule of law. I've taught constitutional law now at various places for about 35 years, federal constitutional law. I have no expertise in Ohio constitutional law other than any other lawyer in the state. But I've taught redistricting for 35 years to my class, so it's something I'm quite interested in. And they have questions because they read the newspapers, my students, and so this particular problem in Ohio came up just last month when we were covering Mills against Sims and one person, one vote, and Rucho against Common Cause, some famous Supreme Court cases. So I dug into it, probably more than I otherwise would have from just reading the newspapers, but that got my interest. And so then I pulled up all the pleadings in the cases, which is really easy to do in Ohio. Ohio's really good about that in terms of public access to the Ohio Supreme Court. And basically what I've discovered is this is an unfortunate, disappointing, what's happening in Ohio right now. Illustration of a phenomenon that's kind of reached across the country in the last few years. It's kind of, you know, if the courts rule against me, then the courts are biased, the courts are wrong, they're just not going to follow what the courts say. We've seen it from our politicians, I don't think a little too much. Maybe something we see it here, unfortunately. In Ohio, the Republican Party, the Ohio Redistricting Commission, you know, they basically just stuck out their tongue, as the professor said, at the Ohio Supreme Court. And the rule of law, when you do that, will not survive. The rule of law is built on respect. And if you don't respect the rule of law, you've got big problems. I think we've got a big problem here in Ohio, unfortunately, as it stands. It shouldn't be that way. The Ohio Supreme Court's decisions, in my opinion, are pretty clear. The Ohio Redistricting Commission and the Republican leadership, however, just chose not to even make a fair stand at correcting the problems that were identified by the Ohio Supreme Court. And with the General Assembly, they even basically said to the Ohio Supreme Court, pardon my French, screw you. We're just not going to do it, which was ridiculous. The argument was what I call constitutionally comical. They said that it was impossible to construct a constitutional map. That was just absurd. Only when the Ohio Supreme Court finally made it clear that they were really seriously considering putting it in contempt did the Ohio Redistricting Commission come back with a map, and it was flawed for the same reasons as the first one. So it's interesting to see what's going to happen here. Legally, constitutionally speaking, you've really got two different problems. You've got one with the General Assembly, and then you've got one with congressional districts. And what could happen with either or both, it could differ. With the Ohio General Assembly, there's been some talk about the Ohio Supreme Court not being able to fix things because the initiative, the constitutional amendment, does say that the Ohio courts are not themselves to draw the maps. But at the end game, eventually, with the General Assembly maps, you're pushed up against the federal Constitution, which requires redistricting. Reynolds against Sims says one person, one vote. The districts that currently exist don't satisfy that. So at some point, the federal Constitution says you've got to fix it. And even the Republicans recognize a court, some court, is going to have to do that. I've taught constitutional litigation along with my constitutional law course for a number of years. And the Ohio courts, including the Ohio Supreme Court, have concurrent jurisdiction over the federal Constitution. And in fact, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, they have to follow the federal Constitution. So the result is that the Ohio Supreme Court, as a matter of federal constitutional law, does have the authority to, at the end, if necessary, draw the General Assembly's map. In my professional opinion, I think that's pretty clear. And I think it's going to have to maybe, exercise that power. With the congressional districts, it's trickier. Whether the Ohio Supreme Court can just draw them unilaterally, because there is a federal statute out there in Title II that says if for some reason the states don't redistrict according to their laws, and there's a default built in, a federal default, and the federal default is at-large districts. For that reason, it may be that no court really could just redistrict Ohio. That's tricky, though. It's a question. It's a question. It may be with the congressional districts if this impasse is not overcome. How do you wind up with 15 seats being voted by at large? That can potentially happen. But again, we shouldn't be there. It shouldn't get to that point. Instead, there's no reason for sticking your tongue out at the Ohio Supreme Court and just saying we're not going to do it. Now that is dangerous. That's extremely dangerous in a system like ours that requires respect for the rule of law. So, in any event, I think I'm probably talking about Thank you very much, Mayor.
Thank you, Professor. Mark Brown, for those remarks and really breaking down and explaining what's at stake and the role of the federal constitution in this process. I agree. The members of the commission should not stick their tongue out at what the Supreme Court says. That is akin to Putinism, I might add. Now I will bring up Deidre Reese from the Ohio Unity Coalition to talk about the impact of the redistricting process for her organization.
Thank you so much, Desiree. Again, I'm Deidre Reese. I'm with the Ohio Coalition on Black Civic Participation, known as the Ohio Unity Coalition. And I wrote out this nice, wonderful speech. She tried to keep some of my emotion in check, but most people have already said what I was going to say, but I can't hold back my emotion. Representing African American voters and other voters of color around the state, I'm very disappointed with what the Redistricting Commission did. They started out by saying they did not take into consideration race as they were drawing the lines, which is really in violation of what they should do under the Voting Rights Act. They have an obligation to make certain that they protect the rights of voters of color so that they would not be kept out of the process. And as we look at what they did, they really did pack and crack voters into districts or took them out of districts just for the sole purpose of diminishing their power. And that is something that should not have happened. And we know that they had a partisan objective, but as an African American voter who did come in and basically held them to task by saying you should not have taken us out of the process, I feel that they are saying to those communities of color across the state that they don't matter. Voters went to the ballot and said, this is what we want. We gave them a prescription for how to do this process and how to do it right. And they have basically snubbed that process in addition to being in contempt of what the Supreme Court has said about this. They can do better and they should have done better. We look at the maps and it doesn't even pass the eye test for a fifth grader, right? You see these squiggles, we see these lines, we see these little loops and hoops. They don't make sense. There's no reason why they should have gone in and drawn lines through a community, an African American community that I grew up in here in Columbus, African American communities in Cincinnati, in Toledo, in Cleveland. It doesn't make sense that these communities are divided the way that they are. They may as well have dropped a bomb like they did in Oklahoma to separate these communities so that they would not actually have political power. And that is not right. It is taking the ability for these folks to be able to choose representatives to represent their interests. And I always give the example, we say that we want a colorblind society. And I say, I don't want things to be colorblind. When I go into a museum and I look at a piece of art, I look at a Monet, I like to see the colors. I like to see the brushstrokes. That's what makes it beautiful and makes it artistic. If everything were just gray, what is that? The beauty of it is that there is that diversity. But there's also the challenge is that there are issues that impact my community differently than what it impacts other communities. So I need to have someone who will take into consideration, you don't necessarily have to look like me, but they have to understand my issues and be willing to raise those issues up. And what we see right now is that people in this state and around the country raise issues and say, we want this issue to be brought forward in the houses of government and be pushed for change. And instead, we have policymakers who say, I'm going to push my agenda. I'm going to push a partisan agenda. Like, let's take away training and safety in order to have a concealed weapon. That's not what people want. That's not what people think is better and good public policy. And they're pushing these fringe pieces of legislation and fringe issues as opposed to represent what constituencies actually want. So I want to be able to elect somebody who will listen to me, who will raise my issues and not divide up the communities of interest that are already in place or at least can be in place after redistricting. So that is what has happened with the maps that have been put forward. So what they're saying to us is communities don't matter. Their issues and their own personal ambitions are more important than good public policy. And that is an affront to the basic idea of representational government, and it should not happen. It certainly is something that is making it even more difficult for communities of color, for people, families who want to see good public policy, for people, veterans, for the labor movement, for everybody, except for those politicians who want to continue to hold on to power at any cost, even when the courts are telling them this is not right, even with the people who have gone and changed the Constitution and said this is a process that we want in place because you haven't done it right before. So here's the prescription. There it was. It was very easy to implement, and instead, once again, a handful of men went behind closed doors and came out with a piece of garbage and said, here's a steak, eat it and enjoy it. It's not right and it shouldn't be that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your passionate remarks regarding the impact of these gerrymandered districts on communities of color and ethnic and racial minority communities across the state. With that, I would like to open it up for members of the press for any questions you may have from distinguished speakers today.
Desiree, a question for you. Last week, Justice Kennedy spoke at a Republican event. She openly talked about redistricting. She claims she did not openly talk about a case, but talked about redistricting overall. A complaint could be made if somebody files it. Do you plan on filing any complaint against Justice Kennedy? Why or not?
I myself, as Desiree Timms,
Or
of
the
equal
public.
districts, we have not discussed that or filing a complaint, but I was alarmed by that. I think we learned, first year law school about the importance of having an unbiased judiciary and making sure we have distinct separate branches of government. And what I saw, what I read was very alarming because it sounded like she was campaigning from the bench. So that's where I would leave that comment.
So you recommend somebody else file a complaint?
I don't have any recommendations for anyone. I could foresee that is something that could happen from interest groups or activists or advocates because of the severity of that remark, especially during a time where we're trying to ask the court for fair districts and to really uplift the democratic process, as well as us being in an election year.
I guess, Professor Gunther, since you helped write some of the legislative language, do you agree that the court could have the potential to impose a map despite the prohibition in that article?
I was part of a 5-person negotiating group, 1 Republican and 1 Democrat, and I was representing the good government groups. We met for 39 hours behind closed doors, and we came forth with the draft of Article 11. And that effectively is what we currently have as our constitutional basis for drawing legislative district boundaries. And I'm appalled that some of the things that I thought we had agreed to, such as Section 6B, which clearly calls for the creation of districts that closely correspond with the partisan preferences of the voters of Ohio over the previous 10 years, that should be challenged, because I thought that was pretty clear cut and provides an unequivocal roadmap for creating creating fair districts for all. I'm sorry, I don't know if I took care of the rest of it.
Professor Brown's argument about the court actually having the ability to impose a map, even though it's prohibited in there, do you agree with that? Or?
In the case of the U.S. Congress, there is no prohibition against the court drawing its own map.
But anyway.
For the state legislature, under Article 11, there is a provision that states that the court does not have the ability to impose a map that is not approved by the Ohio Redistricting Commission. However, one of the things that I find surprising is that we're in uncharted territory here. We never anticipated that the final stages of this process would be, in essence, really tied up with behavior that I never anticipated. For example, it was clear from the language of Article 19 that first there should be a decision by the legislature, and if you don't get a certain level of support from the minority party, it goes to the Ohio Redistricting Commission. Then if they don't get 2 members to support, 2 minority members to support the map, then it goes back to the legislature again. And it's unequivocally clear that the language stipulates that if the legislature does not produce an agreement that has a certain level of minority support, then at that point the unduly clauses kick in, and that is unduly, there should be a prohibition against unduly splitting districts and unduly favoring one party or another. But what's interesting is that Speaker Cupp and President Huffman prevented the General Assembly from dealing with that in that final stage. And they took it back into the Ohio Redistricting Commission on the grounds, they argue, that that means that they're exempt from the unduly clauses. And that is preposterous. I can't imagine how and why that you can decide your own venue and determine your own rules for making a decision that is otherwise so clear-cut in the Ohio Constitution. Now the problem is, we never anticipated when writing Article 11 that there would be a violation of clear declarations from the court. And the court has been unequivocal in declaring the maps unconstitutional. We never anticipated what would happen then if the Ohio Redistricting Commission refused to obey the Constitution and obey the decisions of the Ohio Supreme Court. And that's why I think we're here today, puzzling with how we can bring this process through to a conclusion that is in keeping with the provisions that we enacted by referenda in 2015 and 2018 that were supported by over 70% of the voters of Ohio.
Dr. Gunther, you talked about the things you anticipated and didn't anticipate. Do you anticipate that this is the last time that this state will do redistricting like this? Do you think that there should be another ballot referendum to take this process away from the Ohio Redistricting Commission as it is right now?
Chief Justice O'Connor herself raised that particular issue in her agreement, not a dissenting opinion, but a secondary opinion to the first map, that if the Ohio Redistricting Commission is not going to behave according to the way it's created and the rules set forth in the Ohio Constitution, that perhaps we need to think about redoing the entire structure of decision-making. I am terrified by that prospect. Having been working for 16 years and gone through several sets of initiatives, I know how much work and chaos that can bring about. I'm hoping we can avoid that. And my preference would be that the Ohio Redistricting Commission would behave in accord with the Constitution and the directives of the Ohio Supreme Court.
Do you believe lawmakers, though, cannot be partisan in this process? Do you think lawmakers should be removed from this process in the future?
We anticipated that they might, and I'm hoping that we're not proven wrong by this current process.
Can you talk about what a special master process might look like?
Yeah, a special master is where, actually, Mark, you may want to address this.
Courts will do that quite commonly. The U.S. Supreme Court does it, of course, when it needs to make factual decisions. You appoint a special master and have the master do the fact-finding, draw the maps, report it back to the court, and the court, of course, has to either accept or reject whatever the special master proposes. But that's a pretty common approach to solving a variety of problems, not only redistricting, but boundaries and stuff like that between the states. It's pretty common.
And it is a technique whereby the court can effectively recruit an expert in map drawing that would be responsible to the court, thus freeing the individual members of the court from having to draw the maps themselves. So it's basically subcontracting the process of map drawing to a body that would be accountable to the courts.
So someone like you might be appointed to do that?
I'm not that much of an expert on how to draw the maps, but I could name some people who are.
We're all waiting for the Ohio Supreme Court to rule on this. What effect is that delay having on this process? And I don't know who wants to address this, but what do people hope might happen to break this deadlock that we're currently in?
I think that depends upon whether you favor what the Republican majority is pursuing as compared with the good government groups and the Democratic minority. I personally think that the court should take over the process at this point because, for me, it's become clear that the Ohio Redistricting Commission is not going to proceed in good faith to bring about implementation of the constitutional provisions that we passed in 2015 and 2018. I'm hoping to be proven otherwise, but that remains to be seen.
What do you think of the attempts to make a federal court a three-judge panel take over this process? How do you feel that fits in?
My personal preference is that I would rather have conformity with the Ohio Constitution, which clearly declares the Ohio Supreme Court has the primary authority, it has the original jurisdiction and exclusive jurisdiction over all matters pertaining to the implementation of these redistricting reforms. Mark, would you like to add?
There has been an action filed in federal court, I'm sure you're aware, by various Republicans, not necessarily in privity with the Ohio Redistricting Commission, but I think the writing's on the wall, they really are, but that really doesn't matter. The federal, U.S. Supreme Court has said to federal courts, your involvement in this sort of thing is a last-ditch effort to put the state in compliance with rulings against them. So there are these things called abstention doctrines and comity doctrines. Comity spelled with an I, not comedy, even though this is getting to be more like a comedy. But that say to the federal courts, you don't do it. You let the state courts do it. And you know what? Even if the federal court were to finally get involved, there is in Ohio a certification procedure which would allow the federal court to certify to the Ohio Supreme Court the question that it's basically resolving. So, and I think the federal court would do that. So even if the federal court decided to get involved, which would be a last-ditch, I think, thing, chances are it would certify the question to the Ohio Supreme Court anyway, and you'd wind up wherever you started. So it just seems like a far-fetched solution.
We've heard from a couple of you today suggesting to move the primary, that is part of the solution here. Is there any other option on the table that you think could still result in a fair election in May, or sorry, after?
I think what we heard from Representative Smith and advocates and leaders up here is that a rushed primary with no district numbers, where people don't know who they're voting for. They don't even have the sufficient amount of time to go meet the people they want to vote for them. It is a time crunch and really something that is the doing of the Republican-dominated commission, because they've had months to follow the law and to get this right. And they have not only failed to do their duty, they failed the people of Ohio. And so pushing back the primary, allowing people to cast a ballot for someone they know, they follow, they met, they've heard of, they understand the district number. People in the military across cities have an opportunity to cast those ballots and send them back in time and have their votes counted. It really matters. And what we're seeing time and time again, month after month, is the Republicans' will to undo a democratic process and to undermine 70% of Ohioans across the state. So what we hope is that the Republicans will follow the law. We are in unprecedented times right now because, as the professor said, we could not have imagined that they would just say, we don't care what the court says, we're still gonna submit the same map over and over again that continues to water down the voice of Ohioans across the state.
You may or may not have been asked this, but when you guys want to move the primary back, do you want to have one primary or two? One primary?
Yeah, two primaries is asked.
And when would you want that to be?
I think June is a very reasonable period. We had primaries in June in the past, and it never caused any difficulty. I think this is really an artificial barrier to following the process. It is an artificial constraint on time that is easily fixable, and that involves simply moving it back. I really don't understand why there is such resistance to that simple step.
Do we have any precedent for moving the primary?
Yes, I believe, Mark, do you happen to know?
I know it used to be in June, so I'm sure there's precedent for moving it.
Within the year, that's so close to the date of the
Well, we
primary.
just had the COVID in 2020, they moved the primary, so.
That's right, during COVID, it was moved, like 2 days before. As a candidate during that time, I can tell you how traumatizing that was. Any more questions? Well, if not, we will follow up with the press kit, and email addresses. If we don't have your email, please find Rachel or Matt in the back and make sure we have your contact information. We'd be happy to connect you with some of the panelists today if you have follow-up questions. And we thank you so much for attending this very important press briefing on what's happening in the democratic or undemocratic process of redistricting here in Ohio. Thank you.